So without further ado, we have two wonderful speakers today, and Susanne Caro is from the University of Montana, and I'll let Nan introduce her. And Nan is an RN, and she works with us in Dunn, Byington. And the reason why I chose her as a facilitator is because she's such a word nerd. Like, she's like highly intellectual and like wants documents and backup, and you know, like she understands that sort of philosophy of learning from every piece of information that she can get. So these guys are a good combination in that way. So thank you for facilitating.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, I want to introduce Susanne Caro. She is the Government Documents Librarian at the University of Montana's Mansfield Library. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Creative Writing from the College of Santa Fe, and she is a Master of Library Science from Texas Women's University. Do you wish I would start again? I have read Susan's accomplishments in her professional research, and there are many things that she has done that she deserves your attention and respect for, but my favorite one is the one that earned her the nickname Poxy. Somebody found a bunch of vaccination scabs in a book stored on a library shelf, and Susan did the research to find out where they came from and how old they were, and I'm thinking, vaccination scabs. That's wow.
All about smallpox.
She's very, very interested in strange and unusual things, and she's also very excellent at historical research. It's a big, important interest of hers. And I asked her, what did she find particularly interesting about hospice, and why was that something that she had spent time learning about? And she told me that she's had two family members die, and one of them died in a conventional nursing home, and one of them died with hospice care. And she was impressed with the difference in the experiences, and it made her very interested in where did hospice come from and why is it the way it is. And I'm really interested in hearing what you found out.
Well, part of what I found out is that hospice is a continuation of a tradition that people forgot was a tradition. And it's really connected with how, over time, people took care of their dead and their dying and their family. And if you look back, one thing I find that's interesting about tradition is frequently people say, well, it's tradition. We've always done it this way. Well, no, we didn't always do it that way. We've just been doing it that way for a while. So if you go back, actually not even that far, 100 years ago, what we did is when someone was dying, they were at home, we took care of them. And this could have been for a number of different reasons. It could be that, for one, doctors made house calls. Has anyone here had a house call from a doctor? Yeah, it's not been for... Ah!
Our hospice.
Okay, hospice.
Yeah, right.
And it also depended on how people died. A lot of people used to die of disease far more than a lot of the diseases that are killing us now, things like hypertension, heart disease. Frequently, people didn't live long enough to have dementia. So you might have someone who gets smallpox or measles or the flu, and this was primarily young children. So you'd be caring for them at home, and they would pass on. And actually, when I was looking at it, I think it was about 1890, some of the statistics, you would have, out of all of the people who died in a year, over half of them were under the age of 5. So it just really changed who was passing on. And as medicine caught up, as more people started to get vaccinated, those childhood diseases started shrinking and shrinking, and people started living longer and longer. And that's when you start having more of these diseases that we connect with the elderly, which I'm fine with. I'm completely, happy that my life expectancy isn't 35, because I'm getting close to that. So the death took place in the home, and it was when you were caring for your relatives. And the way we were living together changed. So you would be more likely to have your extended family around you as well. So mom, dad, grandma, the kids, maybe an aunt. So there were going to be more people in the home to take care of you. So everything from doing the sponge baths, helping the person get up, helping them get clothing, seeing that they got their medication, all of these things that hospice does when it goes into the home. It's basically recreating that tradition. But part of what's happened is people have forgotten how that process went, because you have more industrialization, you have more people working, you have men and women working, you have less time that people are spending at home. Grandma may not live with you. So how do you work with that? Plus, it's extremely tiring and difficult to take care of somebody with some of these conditions who might be suffering from cancer, who may have dementia. My great aunt, who passed on a few years ago, had severe dementia. And people with dementia tend to wander. And you need to keep an eye on them 24/7, and that can be very tiring if you're just trying to do it yourself, if you don't know about the services that hospice can provide. So sometimes it very much overwhelms a family. And if you have, two people who are working full-time, they're not always going to be there to administer the medications and everything else. So you start having, one, elderly people not living with their extended family, and two, people who are working so much that they aren't necessarily going to be able to provide that attention. So you have the growth of the nursing home, the growth of the long-term care home. And people started to pull away from that, either because of their situation or maybe because they were just overwhelmed with the treatment that was going to be happening. And so we had hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years where we would take care of these individuals, these family members. And then it starts to shift. So starting about the 1920s, we start to shift. We start having more of these homes. And we start also having this influx in medicine and understanding how to keep people alive. And the focus becomes so much that we're going to do whatever we can keep this individual alive. The time shifts from the family to the hospital. So it's interesting, too, to look at how people were born. As technology got better, as the maternal death rate drops because people are having children in hospitals where the sanitation's improved and they're understanding more, the power goes into the hands of the doctors more and more. So then it's not that unusual to, well, this person's going to need chemo, this person is going to need intravenous feeding. All of a sudden, all of this starts moving more and more into the hospitals. And nobody wants to lose their loved one, so you're doing more and more to keep that individual alive. So I think the statistics are something along like 90% of people would prefer to die at home. But truth is, about 40% of people end up dying at home, in part because you're in this hospital situation. And then it started to change. So it used to be, okay, most people are going to end up dying in the hospital where everything is, possible is being done to extend the life. And this starts to change in the 1960s, when people started to reevaluate how we die. And a big part of this was a woman wrote a book called, I think it's The American Way of Death, where she really looks into what happens at this stage. And her big expose was actually about funeral homes, and some people didn't care very much for how she presented it, especially if they worked in the funerary industry. But she exposed quite a few things that people had never really thought about, in part because this is such a difficult time in your life. Are you really going to go price comparing for a coffin? Most likely not. And as people started thinking more about how they were being treated after death, they started looking more at the whole institution about how they die. And they started looking back more into saying, well, what did we do before this? And hospice made so much sense. You have the majority of people who would prefer to die at home. Not only that, you have people who want their family members to die where they're at home, where they're comfortable, where they're surrounded by people who love them, as opposed to what's often used as a cold and sterile hospital. I don't think anybody really wants to die in a hospital bed. For one, they're not that comfortable. And I think you want to be where you feel you belong, in your own home. So that's when the hospice movement really started to spring back up. And it's taken a little while for that momentum to come up. But now I think people are more aware of it, though not as aware as they should be, because I think everybody should know about it. And then also hospice started working more with nursing homes to provide that kind of care that people really should have towards the end. Now, when my grandfather died, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and he went fairly quickly. And we were shattered. Because, this was Grandpa, and, okay, not tearing up. He died like 16 years ago, and I still tear up. And he ended up dying within 3 months of that diagnosis. And, shoot, I'm tearing up. Oh.
It's okay. You're in the right group.
And yeah, death is a very personal thing, even when it's not you dying. So, but I had never heard of hospice before that time, and we had no idea as a family what kind of options that would bring in. So one of the things they brought in was oxygen, and that helped him so much. And helping him to use the bathroom and all of these things that were of so much help to us. And my grandfather died while my mother was rubbing his feet. And that is such a beautiful way to go, to be surrounded by people that you care about. And it also feels very natural, sort of like, at least to me, that this is the way we should go. We should go in our own homes. And if there's not much more that can be done for you, then you should be comfortable and you should be surrounded by the people who care about you. So I think it's now about around 40% of people now die in their own homes, and a large chunk of that population is receiving hospice care, and it's giving them the option to die at home. Any questions? Because I know way too much death trivia at this point.
Do you have any idea, I actually have a feeling that most people who die at home are not dying in hospice, that hospice is not being used anywhere near as much as it could be. Do you have any idea about what percentage of that 40% that hospice is?
I think it's something around 20%. 20-25%. So that's still quite a few people who are not receiving hospice care, and often you'll end up hearing about them in the newspaper where police are investigating an unintended death, and it's simply an older person who has died at their home. I don't know how often that's a sudden death where they had been in good health until that time, or how often it was more of a lingering condition. But yeah, I definitely do think hospice could be utilized a lot more, so get the word out.
You're certainly working on that. Do you know if hospice, what in America, is different from, say, for instance, in Europe? Is hospice more? Because I have a feeling, and it's just a feeling, that hospice was more consistently in existence in those countries and cultures that had, for instance, sanatoriums or you know, where the culture includes things like 6 weeks of vacation a year, you know, just a greater sort of comfort and familial, you know, support is embedded in the culture. I'm not sure about that. That would be a guess.
It varies. It varies from country to country. And in some countries, the whole view of health is very different. So, for example, in France, doctors still make house calls, in part because if you're sick, do you really want people traveling and spreading their contagion and then sitting in a room full of sick people? So it's more common in some countries to actually have the doctor go to the home and provide care. In some countries such as Japan, they actually have quite a few nursing homes. That's actually a rather large segment because, for one, it costs a great deal for real estate in Japan. And also, I think they actually have negative population growth at this point and a very large elderly population compared to the younger population. So you don't have quite as many people who would be fulfilling that caretaker role. So it really varies from country to country, but I think in Europe, because of a longer tradition of socialized medicine, that it's more consistent that people will remain in their home for longer if possible.
Any of you thinking of something you want to know?
How does it look internationally? Or is hospice, as we think of it, more of a Western cultural idea? Does it still continue to happen kind of more organically? Have you looked at that piece?
A little bit. It really depends on the country. And there's a difference in the developed world as opposed to what's considered to be the undeveloped world. So for instance, in a country like India, you're more likely to have that extended family that's continuing to live in the same premises. So in many cases, you might have somewhat stronger family ties and family support network within the home. And you're probably going to be more likely to end up having that same sort of home care that's traditional in many other countries. It's in the developed countries where people have moved away from having family take care with an individual at the end of life. But I don't think it diminished quite as much in the countries where socialized medicine was more constant, because you kept a lot of the end of life and the sickness that occurred in the home as opposed to sending it out to the hospital, sending it out to the nursing home. And those nursing homes can be very expensive for someone to go to. So if you don't have the funds, you're going to be more likely to keep the individual at home and to keep the end-of-life care at home. I can't give you like the dynamics on statistics on every country.
One of the things that strikes me as I'm listening is I try to imagine what it would be like to do my job 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. Or more specifically, not so much my job, but the job of our CNAs, our certified nursing assistant, to give care to a bedbound person without the high-tech kind of tools that we have, like disposable underwear, or hygiene, all the kind of easy hygiene tools that we have, cleansing lotions that don't have to be rinsed, or or antiseptic gels that you can de-germ your hands without water, or but mostly I just think of all that disposable stuff. And it, when I think about just the laundry that would be involved at a time when we didn't have washing machines. So not only are we helping people stay home, helping people stay home, and to some degree reproducing what is maybe the best of a hospital or a higher technological level of assistance, and bring that into the home. Sort of professional care brought into the home is different again than the family having to figure it all out, and to come up with all of the services from among their own resources. That is, I think that's a further evolution of hospice care. And interestingly, when we go into assisted living, where we're not, that is their home, that's their home, that's where they live now, and we're not bringing the technology because it exists, that the place provides it. And so what we are doing more is helping the family come back in, rejoin their loved one in their professional home, and bring their hearts and their minds into the end of that person's lives, while the details of the care are taken care of professionally.
And one of the things you mentioned, hygiene. Our concept of hygiene has changed radically, and I think one of the reasons why women ended up moving so quickly into the nursing profession is because traditionally women were the nurses in the home. So it would be the mother, the sister, the cousin, the aunt, who would be sitting with the person and taking care of all of those little details. And it wasn't until the 1880s, the 1890s, that people really started to understand hygiene. And the idea that bathing regularly is a really good idea. We had a somewhat different idea of bathing and how disease can be passed from one person to the next. So our whole concept of that changed fairly radically. And one thing that some people really don't know is that the Victorians were nuts about cleanliness, because that was when it was really first coming out that, oh my gosh, you mean this dirty laundry could actually make me sick? So that's when they really started working on boiling that laundry, and using lye-based soaps has been around for a very, very long time. But you cleaned your house from top to bottom every single day. So the whole cleanliness aspect really changed. And it wasn't unusual for the doctor to sit with the person at those final moments as well, and to provide those house calls. And as more women went to the nursing profession, they might go along with the doctor and stay for a longer period of time.
That makes me think of, we're talking about language, and I do love language, and there are some phrases that come from sitting with the dying. Burning the midnight oil and burning the candle at both ends are two things that have come to me, and those phrases come from sitting with the ill, and that those long, lonely hours in the night, and when there's nothing to do but watch them, really watch. And that is also, was primarily what women did, and probably why we died before we were 40.
One of the many.
Hard work to sit with sick people hours after hours, but that is also the death watch.
And then do all of the laundry.
And do all of the laundry and take care of the regular needs of the household. Although, as you point out, death was much more regular. In being intimately involved with death has always been, up until maybe the 1940s or 50s, really much more part of everybody's everyday life. The sitting, the observing, and the intimate care part.
It was more around the 1920s where the hospital was accepted as a place where you would go to be healthy, as opposed to a place you would go because you were poor and you would die. Because the hospitals, for a very long period of time, was the last resort. And if you went to the hospital, it meant you couldn't afford to be cared for at home, or you didn't have any family to care for you at home. And because they didn't understand things like washing your hands, there was a good chance that if you went to the hospital, you would die, and it wasn't not necessarily what you went in for. So a lot of women died because of an infection that was passed when they gave birth in a hospital. And one doctor, I think he was German, yes, he did a study of what happened if you washed your hands in between seeing every patient. And the recovery rate jumped 90%. And when this got out, a lot of doctors looked at this and said, "You don't know what you're talking about, you're a fraud. We are not spreading any kind of disease." So even when it came out that you need to wash your hands, a lot of people were opposed to it. And one thing that a surgeon would do is they had these coats that they would wear when they performed surgery. They never washed them. It was a badge of honor how much gore you had on your operating coat. So the infection rate was appalling. You did not want to go to a hospital if you could avoid it. And this really changed, especially with places like Johns Hopkins, when they started to really push the idea of hygiene. Johns Hopkins started the whole process of wearing rubber gloves when you were working with someone, of wearing masks, of wearing white so you could see and clean all the gore, of wearing tennis shoes because they were easier to clean. And as that acceptance of hygiene started to increase, people were more willing to go to these places and even saw it preferable to staying at home. So when the preference went from the home to the hospital is when you really start to see this change, and you're more likely to die in the hospital.
Semmelweis was so ostracized and so desperately depressed about the outcome of his work, he died in a mental asylum. Mm-hmm. He never knew about his fundamental contribution to the world. He died before it was accepted.
Yeah.
He never got it, which is just a very sad story.
He's sort of the father of modern hygiene in that sense.
One of the things I think is so interesting, we were talking about earlier, like green burials and different options around memorial services. Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to. Well, one of the other things I came across in my research was that the idea of the open casket only came around the time of the Civil War. And before that, you would always have a closed casket. But then they started to embalm, and they started doing more that would actually keep the human body in fairly good condition, which was really good if you had, family who were traveling. And some people could not stand this because they thought it was pagan to have the body out for viewing, and that it was a form of body worship. And this continued up into about the 1960s. But you have embalming, and everybody wanted to be embalmed. And previously, only a person of great importance would be viewed. You had to be, a president, a member of a noble family, and that's how you would have a viewing. And Americans kind of democratized that. It was like, no, we can afford to have the person embalmed. We are going to have the person embalmed, and everybody will come and see, this individual. So it kind of changed, and the funerary practices changed, and more went to the funeral home, and more interest got put into the casket. And at one point, you could even buy a special outfit for the person to wear when they are in the casket. And it kind of exploded as all of these different things that you could do. And in some cases, you might want this person to have a big funeral because it showed that how important they were. And like many things, this is sort of the swinging of the pendulum. And it went from really big, and now it's starting to swing back to, wait a minute, why are we doing this? So I believe currently the estimated cost of a funeral, which we now consider to be traditional, is almost $8,000. Well, that's basic. You know, that's the Honda Civic. It's not the Cadillac. It can go much, much higher than that. So people start going, well, wait, why are we doing this? And as more awareness of the environment is coming up, it's like, well, do we really need to embalm? Because there's a lot of chemicals involved with embalming. And a lot of them are pretty nasty. And they've gotten better. Less mercury, less arsenic, more formaldehyde. But, you know, why do we need to do that? And then also cremation really jumped in acceptance. So you can decide, well, instead of necessarily burying someone, you can plant them. So you can get a biodegradable paper container for ashes. I don't like the word cremains for some reason. It makes me think of Raisinets. I don't know why. Yeah, like craisins, you know, that sort of thing. But you can have the ashes placed into one of these, and there'll be seeds in that paper. So once you bury them, you can have a tree come out of it. And when you're looking at a green funeral, usually, and I don't want to say technically because this is new enough that they haven't, in some cases, really figured out what really constitutes a natural burial. Is that going to be with a coffin, with some other type of container, with no container at all? So people are still figuring this out, but the truth is the options are all out there. For some cases, you don't want any metal because metal biodegrades at a very different rate than wood. Do you want to use a hardwood? Do you want to use a softwood? The amount of wood that's actually buried as a result of funerals is almost staggering. I mean, it's tons and tons of wood that we're putting people in before we put them in the ground. So you can get a softwood, usually like something like a pine, which biodegrades faster than a hardwood. You can have a container or a casket that's made without nails, either just glued together or held together with dowels. That's going to degrade at a different rate. You can just be wrapped in a shroud and buried. And if you decide to go the cremation route, they're looking at different ways you can do that because it actually takes, I think it was, I can't remember off the top of my head. I know the 2000 was in there somewhere. A large quantity of natural gas is used in order to reach the right temperatures to reduce a body to ash. So some people are looking at more green ways of doing that. In Northern Europe, in some places, they're recycling the heat. And the heat from the cremation process is getting piped to buildings to provide heat for buildings and for the living as well as for the dead. And there's a bio method of reducing a human body as well that some people in Florida are developing. But one thing I like about the idea of cremation is you have so many more options because that is considered to be inert. You don't have to worry about if the person died of a disease or any of the many processes that happen to human remains once someone has passed on, because there's a whole slew of things that happen that I don't think I'll get into. But you can be buried in wicker. You can be buried in a jar. You can be buried in an unfired ceramic, which is basically just going to return to dirt. So there's a lot of options that you can have with a green burial.
Something I learned recently that I'm very excited and I want everybody to know is that you can be buried on state land. You can be, if you know more, do you know the details of that? Would you say what they are?
Yeah, our chaplain and I met with their coroner, and it was really enlightening. And as is typical of Montana, we have a lot of freedoms and individuality protected. So I would encourage us all to pay attention to that because that can be changed, easily with laws and administrative rules, and our choices might be reduced. So currently under state law, You can be buried on state land. You have to check with the coroner. There are different protocol and paperwork to fill out. You can keep a body at home for as long as you want. After 48 hours, you need to make sure the body is kept below 39 degrees. So that can be a little tricky if it's not January. But
Or not tricky at all if it is January.
right, if you can find a way to keep the body cool, then you can keep the body at home for as long as you want. You can move a body with the proper form. And the advantage of having hospice involved, of course, is that when hospice is involved, a coroner is not called at the time of death. So if there is not hospice involved, for example, we cared for my mother-in-law, and I don't know why, but we did not have hospice. We were kind of our own hospice, I guess. And so we kept her for a while, but we did have to have the coroner come. And they're very wonderful. It wasn't uncomfortable for us in any way, but it was a piece of the process, and it was kind of funny because we kind of just sat around and waited for the coroner before we called anybody. It was kind of like we had to wait for the government to proclaim that she was actually dead before we could call family, but we all knew she had died. You can, so the coroner comes if there is no hospice, and you can keep the body, you can move the body. There's a form that needs to be filled out so that if someone passes away in the backyard and you want to move them into the home, because hospice wasn't involved, of course, the coroner has to rule that it was not, there was no criminal involvement. And then you can bring the person inside the home if you would like to keep them there for a while. And then there's a separate form to transport the body. And so a person, and I'm working with an individual now who really feels strongly about bringing their loved one themselves to the crematory. So he has a beautiful feather bed in the back of the Suburban, and he's got it all planned out. So we have options that we don't necessarily know we have unless you seek them out, because they're not widely known, and because there are services available for you. Those are what we know more about, because those services are things that people use as their income. And so the way we have our culture designed is, we typically know more about things that people can make money from. So there are options in Montana, and then again, one of those is that you can be buried on private property or on state land. With state land, you have to just have the proper form filled out and follow the appropriate protocol. You can have a tree burial as long as you collect the remains and dispose of them properly.
Yeah.
So we really have a tree burial. So there's really lots and lots of options.
What do you mean?
There was this guy in Helena that was in the corner like, well, if I want to, hang my body in a tree and let birds peck at it, is that legal? And he was like, yes, you can do that.
Which happens in some cultures.
Yeah, but as long as you make the best attempt to collect the bones, because they don't want human bones lying around. And he's like, what if I want to drag my body up into the wilderness and have wolves eat it? He said, yes, you could do that too, but then you have to do your best attempt at collecting all of the human bones, because that would wear people out. So it's crazy in a way that we don't look at that more, because that is so normal. And, to have those rights protected in Montana is really such a unique thing. I mean, I think we're very fortunate for that. And Nancy's completely right. To keep our eyes on that and make sure that those things stay protected for people who might want that. I mean, that's crazy. I don't know if I put my body up in a tree, but I think about making a bone hammock. Like, I don't know.
One of my favorite death rituals that I've learned about, and I haven't made sure this is true. This actually comes from a short story I read once, but I'm pretty sure it's true. In Greece, people, when someone dies, they're buried in their own grave, and after 5 years, they're dug up. Their bones are dug up, and they are placed in a community ossuary. So the whole village's bones are kept in a particular place, and the 5-year period is the grieving period. After 5 years and 1 day, your widow can wear a red dress again, and your kids are free to stop weeping, and things go on. But they have this very prescribed period, and then this movement. Okay, now this body is ready to rejoin the community in the community spot, and we are free now to enter a different phase of our relationship with you and your death.
I love ossuaries.
Yeah,
And it's
Tell me
funny,
what-
too.
I don't really know much about them.
Okay,
Tell me about
well-
what you know about ossuaries.
One interesting thing, the ancient Greeks and Roman had a long history of cremation. And that became then viewed as being pagan.
Pagan, that's where that
So you would instead, in order to be resurrected at the end time, would bury the body intact. And this became quite a big thing, that you would be buried intact because then you would rise again. Well, there's a problem with this, and that is you run out of room for all the bodies. So what do you do with when you're running out of room and you don't necessarily have any more? Right, and I'm sure land is somewhat at a premium there. So it became more traditional to dig the body up. Well, after 5 years, you're going to have pretty much bones, if anything is going to be remaining. So then you would dig up the individual, clean them off, but you still had to put them somewhere. So they started doing these ossuaries, and these are actually somewhat common in Europe. So there'd also been a long history of catacombs. So you hear about the Roman catacombs. A lot of early Christians would be placed in these niches. Well, it's a pain to dig a catacomb. So again, this person would, hopefully for them, be reduced to a skeletal remain, and then you'd put them somewhere. Well, it's also much more space efficient to put certain bones with certain bones. And then people started getting creative with this. And there's a whole area of ossuary art. So you might have a row of femurs, a row of skulls, a row of femurs, a row of skulls. Or you might have an area where they just sort of packed most of these bones into a section and then did these decorative portions. And next thing you know, you have bones going up the pillars. You have bones going up archways. You have chandeliers made out of vertebrae. They got really creative. And it got to the point that they wanted people to see these. And it goes into part of this tradition of memento mori, which is to get people to reflect on their own death. What better way to go into an area that's full of your relatives and everybody else's relatives and hundreds of years worth of people, but a lot of it started simply because they were running out of space in the cemeteries. But every 5 years, you could dig someone up and put someone new in that space.
So I just looked it up on my phone because I don't know how I found this, but this is what happens when you work in death-related business or have that interest. There's one, and I can't remember what country it is, the Sedlec ossuary, and it is an entire church made of human bones, and it's beautiful. It's SEDLEC, so if you have a chance, Google image, you'll be really, really amazed. And there's a great history and story about how this church was built. But it was very similar of people needing to create space. And there was I believe it was like a hermit monk who was in charge of the cemetery. And he took it upon himself to start this building. And then it was finished up later after he passed. But the entire thing is human bones.
There's a great book called Empire of Death that talks about the ossuaries and has fabulous illustrations of all of these different ossuaries and how people think of the dead. And it's interesting to see how many Montana laws actually deal with someone after they've died. That it's like, well, yeah, it doesn't end with death. It keeps going. I kind of like the idea of my remains being turned into artwork. I think that's not a bad way to go. And body donation, too, is a huge area.
You reminded me of something that I wanted to ask. I understand that ashes can be, and I understand it's also expensive, made into gems.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
That's a process that's fairly recent, and basically we're carbon, and when you reduce a person to ash, that's basically what you have left is the carbon. Diamonds are made out of carbon, so some entrepreneurs figured out a way to take ashes and have them turned into a stone. It can be very expensive, and it's expensive depending on what size of stone you want and what color, because they're basically taking this base material with a starter piece of diamond to act as a catalyst for the crystalline growth of the diamond. So the smaller the diamond, the less amount of time it's going to take. And depending on the color of the diamond, the less time it's going to take. So I think it can go somewhere around, oh gosh, a few thousand to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what you want. But you can get clear diamonds, yellow, green, blue, and I think like a pink or a red color of diamond. And this leads to a very interesting situation which you can find yourself in, which is that your loved one could be stolen. So if you've got a jar on the mantle that says grandpa, a burglar's probably going to be less likely to take that than the contents of a jewelry box. I think it's a beautiful way to remember someone. I think I would be paranoid that someone might steal my loved one, and that also means someone might be out there wearing your loved one and having absolutely no idea.
Oh, the problems.
Talk about first world problems. My grandmother got turned into a diamond and we were robbed.
One of the interesting things about all this historical shifting and changing is how it seems to be motivated by practicality.
It frequently is. And when people started moving and you didn't have a big family house, you might have an apartment, it becomes a whole different issue of, well, what do you do with the dead body?
No parlors.
No parlors. And then you have the growth of the funeral industry, and you have the growth of the death specialist. And I think for a lot of people, too, it changed with the Romantic era, where more focus was placed on the emotional turmoil that people were going through and expressing your grief. So I think for a lot of people, it can be very nice to be able to put all of those details and not have to think about them, and have someone else take care of all of that. But at the same time, then you kind of missed out on sort of the day-to-day practicality of death as well. So we might change for one reason, but then change back for another.
I remember this movie that Sally Field starred in, and it was set in the 1930s, and in the movie, this character's husband dies, and he's laid out on the kitchen table to be bathed, and Sally Field's character says, "This is the first time," she says something like, "I have borne 2 children to this man, and this is the first time I've ever seen him completely naked." Because of our culture at the time, and how men and women managed their intimate lives, she probably only made love in the dark and maybe even partially clothed, and here at this time now, this other the remarkable intimacy of the last bath on the kitchen table. And I always remember that scene in that movie of how she was just reflecting on, I've never seen him naked.
And that's also one of the times
She
most
may
vulnerable.
never have if she's handed him over to somebody else.
Yeah, it's not just too of physical nakedness, it's
Right.
an emotional nakedness. I mean, that's probably when we are the most vulnerable, so when we're first born and we're naked, and when we die.
And unable to protect us.
We are at the mercy of whatever is going to come to us. And I think that's one of the reasons why, too, people are very protective of their dead. Because who else is going to speak? They cannot speak for themselves.
Or
Unless they have an
or
advance
unable
directive.
to, Please take care of this because I can't deal.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Because we're unaccustomed to dealing at that level of intimacy with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, kind of switching back to your discussion about people dying at home in the late 1800s, are you aware of any texts or references that women produced about dying at home? How did we share that lore on how to make that happen other than witnessing our mothers and grandmothers? I wonder if there's any written documentation about what women did in the home or families did in the home with their loved ones.
There is remarkably little documentation, in part because, for multiple reasons, historically, women's areas, women's issues were not written about. It was passed down orally and through experience. When you had a family member dying, the mother or the sister or some female relative would be working with this, often with a daughter or another female relative. And you learned how to do this simply because this is what you did. It was like there weren't a whole lot of midwives' journals or instructions until men started becoming the male midwife. And then they start publishing about this. And it becomes this sort of male area that they're taking over. There were a few midwife journals, but then also there's remarkably little written about death. If it wasn't specifically about the last rites or something in a religious context, you wouldn't get all that much. Where you're going to have some difference in that is, say, like in the Jewish tradition, there are certain things that you do on certain days, and if you are working with a dead body, then there are also certain cleansing rituals that you would need to do with that. So there's a little bit there, but frequently this was experience, and this was tradition and oral history that was going on.
Women didn't know how to write or read.
And frequently people felt, well, you're just going to get married and have children. You do not need to know how to read. Why would you need to do that? You know?
Yeah, I still haven't done it yet. So, you know, we were talking about this earlier, but I didn't know that there was a place to do green burials, so a burial where you weren't embalmed and that you were in a natural casket in Montana, but you said that you found a place that was.
Yes. It's located by Swan Lake, and these people have a ranch area that they are converting into a natural burial. So you can, I think, be buried in a shroud or a container that does not contain metal. And instead of, we've sort of gotten used to cemeteries that are very green. And part of that was to create a park-like atmosphere that was welcoming to people. Not something that they would necessarily associate with death. So you have statuary and you have all these other aspects. And then you start getting those flat headstones because it's a lot easier to run a lawnmower over that. In this area, they don't maintain the grounds. They're left natural. So you look at, you don't, or you wouldn't necessarily think cemetery, you'd see fields, trees, just a natural environment. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you can have like a rock to mark the spot, maybe engraved or something like that. But you know, no big monuments or anything that. It's just going back to the earth.
Is this a family who has a soldier who died, a son who died in they wanted to be able to bury their son in their home place in this way, and then they got, it was in the Missoula, I think.
Yeah.
And so then they had dedicated their land for this purpose.
The story I read, I think it was actually that they had wanted to find a way to preserve the land.
Oh.
And there's a lot of regulations about disinterring. So if they found that if they really wanted to keep this land natural, one of the best ways to do that was to fill it with people. And they started that way, and there was this great part of that article of an individual who was dying and wanted a natural burial. And that he was getting ready for that. They're fairly new. I think they only started a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so interesting because there is a lot to burial that I wasn't aware of. I didn't understand that you needed to have like a cement lining of so many feet of cement, and then also a casket that had to be, it could be anything, and then also you have to be embalmed to be in many cemeteries. I didn't understand how much more we were putting into the ground than just a human body.
Right.
So that's appealing to me to know that there is a place where you could do that. I think it's kind of silly when Montana, we're lucky we have a lot of space, but it seems.
So those
like
rules apply to cemeteries?
Yeah.
I see.
Well, it depends on the cemetery, because there is no state law that requires a concrete vault or a casket. But an individual cemetery might. So for example, in Missoula, you can't have a green burial in the cemetery. They do require a vault. I can't remember if they require a casket, but I think they do. And part of that is some places will do that because when things degrade, like they do, you can have a dip. And that prevents the ground from becoming uneven and that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily required. There's actually a really interesting case in Louisiana that I believe it has not been accepted, but it is going on to the Supreme Court, where you could not buy a casket except from a funeral home in Louisiana, unless you bought it from out of state. So if you bought it from out of state, you could have it shipped in, but you could not buy it from an independent individual in Louisiana. And a monastery started building coffins like they had for their own individuals for many, many, many years, and started looking to selling them, and this became a legal issue. And so far, this is really interesting, it's been decided that you cannot require someone to purchase a casket from a particular dealer when your state does not require a casket. There's actually no law in Louisiana requiring a casket for burial. But yet this other law had been created saying you would have to buy them from a funeral director. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes.
Well, and that's interesting too, because in Louisiana and New Orleans, especially the very famous graveyards there that are all mausoleums above ground because of the water table, which, it's a big part of Louisiana culture. And other cultures too. My daughter's father is from Russia, and what I learned in my marriage then was they would have, and I think this is common in a lot of cultures, annual festivals at the graveyard, where you go and you bring a picnic and everybody's there on the same day and you're all sitting around on grandma's grave having a party. And it's sort of, and that's when everybody sort of cleans up and trims things and scrubs the moss off the stone.
That used to be what you did on Memorial Day. In certain days, you would go out and you would take care of the plot. And that actually is in a number of different cultures. In Latin America, you've got Day of the Dead. In some Asian countries, you have like a family day where you go and you remember your loved ones. In some places in South America where they do a natural mummification, you might actually bring the person out as part of this big celebration day, the actual mummy. And in some cases, it might be the skeleton. You bring everybody out because you don't want to leave them out for the big party, you know. They're still very much there. And a couple other odd little things. If you're doing cremation, you have to wait 48 hours after the death. You cannot be cremated with a pacemaker because they can explode. I had no idea.
Wow.
But I guess if you wanted to go out with a bang, that would be one way of doing it. You also shouldn't bury someone in a floodplain, in part because you don't want them drifting downstream. And I think, just as a guideline, 150 feet from surface water or a well. And those are basically the kind of guidelines you want. But in Montana, besides that, if there aren't is not a specific ordinance for the city or the county, and some counties do have ordinances either allowing or not allowing family burial, you've got quite a few options. And you can be freeze-dried. I also learned that you can be freeze-dried and then pulverized instead of being incinerated. You know, there's a lot of retirees in Florida, and that's where I'm hearing a lot of it.
I don't know why. A division of Disney Corporate.
No, that was cryogenics. That was keeping you frozen forever.
Right. Well, what I'm thinking that's interesting is that we're still, there's so much energy-intensive technology involved in what we're doing with each other that still is sort of a very kind of hands-off. Change this human remains into something I can tolerate, like a diamond, or something that doesn't scare me.
Well, some people you can have a very gut reaction to something like a skeleton.
Oh, yeah.
And the processes that go on when you pass are not necessarily pleasant. And I think it was in the 1830s, Spain issued a declaration that in all Spanish territory, you could not be buried in the church. You had to be buried outside of the town limits. And for years and years and years, people would be buried in the church cemetery or underneath the church itself. And they started getting worried about contagion, but they hadn't quite figured it out yet. It was misma. It was something in the air. And they associated foul air and bad smells with disease. And well, when anything dies, the processes that happen release gases that don't necessarily smell pleasant. So you start getting more of a feel of, well, maybe this is bad health-wise. So you move them outside of town. And you move them so that they're not around water. So in the 1830s, in a lot of places, they disinterred people from the churches and moved them outside of town, in part to get that whole burial area established, but also because they were trying to get this away. And I think that's a very interesting way of how we relate, but at the same time, in many places, they still had relics. You would have a bit of a saint. But I guess because they were a saint, you didn't have to worry about contagion or anything like that. But you might have a skull, or a hand, or a foot, or an arm, or an incorruptible. For a long time, the incorruptibles were a big deal, and that was an individual who didn't necessarily decompose like you were used to. It was more of a natural mummification, or in some cases helped, mummificated state. And there's still some places in Europe where these incorruptibles can be viewed, and they're hundreds of years old. But yeah, unless you're a saint, you get out of town.
Yeah.
What was the other thing we were talking about the other day? It was about cinnamon. You said that there was a specific flower that smelled like cinnamon.
Counterscents. scents that will counteract another scent. And one of the scents that will counteract a recently degrading body is cinnamon. And one of the flowers that has a very, very strong cinnamon scent is lilies. Lilies happen to be a traditional funerary flower, and flowers have a long tradition with death and burial, in part because you're putting something sweet with something that's starting to smell not so sweet. So lilies traditionally been a very common flower, but I think it's that cinnamon scent was one of the reasons why it was originally chosen for that purpose. Was you don't notice quite so much.
Well, cinnamon also would be, to some degree, would slow down the degradation. The essential oils are antimicrobial, and it's microbes that cause the decay. So it also slows down the process. But it's mighty expensive to cover somebody in cinnamon.
Right.
So the lilies are more, not part of that process. But something like a protective grade.
Yeah, and you would have ice frequently too. If you were having the person weighed out, you would, have them sitting on or laying on blocks of ice to help keep them cool, so certain things did not happen.
Inevitabilities.
Actually, it's interesting. One of the reasons why JFK had a closed coffin was because his wife Jackie did not like the idea of having an open casket. They were Catholic, and the Catholics are one of the groups who felt that open caskets were not necessarily the right way to go. So that was one of the reasons why his coffin was closed. Lincoln, his casket was open and touring. So they were probably going to be using quite a bit of ice and quite a few lilies for him. It's a good thing he was thin, because there was one pope who died in the summer, and they had the big viewing and everything, and often when it's warmer, things progress a little more quickly, and apparently in the middle of the funeral, he went. So ice is a very good thing.
So what she's referring to, if you don't know, is gas buildup and his body eruption, which is dramatic and unpleasant, and guaranteed to happen to a human being as well as a deer on the side of the road. We have become a lot less willing to personally experience the unpleasant. We go a long way to deodorize our lives. And that means that we are also then separated from a lot of reality. We are avoided of a lot of reality. And we abandon each other. We abandon each other when we start to smell or look bad before we're dead.
Yeah, a story comes to mind of an experience recently in my work as a hospice social worker, where the matriarch is home and she's dying, and the caregiver is saying, well, this family member's staying away because her kids are only 5 and 7. And I said, that seems like a great reason to be here.
Yeah.
And what will they think happened to Grandma? And so we continue still to do that protection, and it's the adults protecting themselves, I think, more than really necessarily protecting the children. Because when we start to discuss, well, what are we protecting them from? There's really not an answer, and the person starts to think, well, yeah, what am I? So we're kind of in this habitual. And then on the flip side, in the same week, I'm in the hospital, and there's a child with her mother, and her mother's actively dying. So we're making progress, but I feel like I have my foot in two worlds sometimes. We're really trying to embrace and educate and inform and provide options and choices, and then we're not going to let anybody see Grandma in her own bedroom, in her own bed, because she's healing. And so we're still kind of afraid of that.
The 5 and 6-year-old are going to have questions.
Exactly.
And we haven't talked about it, and we don't know what we'll say. And it's important. We want our children to have the information we want them to have, but we don't know what it is because we haven't thought about it ourselves. Because it's
And the answer's going to make us feel sad and scared.
yeah.
Because then we have to talk about our own mortality. And then what if the child says, well, are you going to die, Mommy? And so we all have to practice talking about it. Practice talking about it over and over. This is a great place to do that.
Well, that, and also I've heard some people where, you know, they've had someone die when they were very young and they're just told, oh, this person just went away. And then they're left wondering, well, when are they coming back? And that's just going to lead to more questions. And then, you know, how does that person feel years later when you realize you couldn't even tell me this person died? So it's difficult, but I think in the long run, it's better to just be honest, and we're all going to die. I've yet to meet anyone who is immortal. So why are we so afraid of this? This is something that we're all going to have to deal with at one point or another. We might as well be active in it. We might as well make our desires known. And if possible, have a little bit of fun with it. When I go, I want there to be a party. I want it to be something positive, not necessarily something depressing or simply to remind other people that they might go to hell. I've been to some of those funerals, they're not fun. But, you know, if that's what you want, you know, that's your option. But know what your options are, and to whatever extent you're comfortable, embrace it.
One thing we've been doing, and our chaplain has been really helpful in helping us and helping me talk to people about what I'm now calling the sacred time, which is right after a loved one passes and before the funeral home comes. And like I discussed with my family and my mother-in-law, it was kind of a weird, awkward time. We're sitting around, just waiting for the corner, and what do you do? And sometimes you're with family members that you haven't seen in a while. And so that can, you know, and so we've enclosed, put a flyer kind of talking about, thinking about that time ahead of time. We don't want to, but it's going to happen. So think about that. Now the hospice is here, and think about how you want that to look. When Grandma passes, your nurse might be here or they might not be, but you'll call them and then they will be here. And the nurse will help you if you want, or do it all, him or herself, take care of the patient's body and clean her up or clean him up, put the clothes on that you might desire. So think about that. Are there clothes that you think this person would want to leave home in? And think about what you want to do with that time. Is there special music that you want to have set aside, ready to play? Are there pictures? Do you want to build an altar? Do you have a list of people to call? There's no right or wrong thing to do, but think about what to do in that sacred time, because that is your final time with that individual in your home. And so that's I'm really excited that we're helping people think about that and label it and make use of that incredible time when you're at home with your loved one after they've passed.
Someone in our community made a very public story of when their son died and they didn't have hospice and the coroner had to come, and they were unhappy with that event. And the gift that they gave to our community was saying, hey, this is what happens. And if you don't want that, hospice is your helper. That's, they missed the part about thinking through that and having help that makes all of that officialdom not required. So this is a gentler officialdom. We take care of the paperwork, and the presence of hospice is the formal official way to avoid formal officialdom, which I think is a very important thing that I hope everybody talks about when you're talking with the people that you know about when you came here tonight. What you learned is that we can't avoid our cultural need for documentation and safety and following the rules and making sure there's no malintent anywhere. We have set up law enforcement and regulations to protect us, but then we're also subject to them. And so the way that hospice protects families and your individuality is by making it so that you don't have to bring that part of our community agreements. We have these agreements with each other, and so hospice kind of takes care of all that so that you can just do your family thing. And it's a nice evolution through the history where when it was just families, taking care of families, it was so hard. It was so much work. It was very, very difficult for family members to take care of all of the dying. And so the professionalization of this went, as you noted, all the way over to where we only did it in hospitals and we were separated out from it. And now we're swinging back to this place where we have both the official protections, but we also have our individuality and our personal needs and desires protected. And hospice can help you do that.
How does hospice, I think one of the things you're talking about is people used to take care of their own. And that was kind of a need of people who cared about this dying person to contribute to care. How does hospice help the families to do what they need to do in caring?
We stand back. We find out, what do you want? And if there's something that we can offer, we offer it, we supply it. If you don't want anything, we don't have to do anything. It's about what hospice does is help you do what you want, the way you want it done. Someone thought she might like to die outside. And when she was dying, we brought her outside. She got to go outside one last time. And of course, if she'd been in a hospital or in an institution, that would have been highly unlikely. So, absolutely, it's not even at home, One of the things that's really broke my heart open more than once is when some of our patients live in assisted living, and they've lived there a long time. And the people who take care of them have taken care of them for years. When they die, those women want, and young men and young women, they want to be the ones. They don't want the hospice nurses doing the bathing. They want to do that as a final gift and a way of dealing with their own grief about the loss of this person that they've been taking care of. And it's my pleasure to just stand back and make sure they got what they need and let them do that. And it's so touched me to see these very young people who are not family members, but doing this really precious work for the person that they care for. So, same thing. Sometimes, the hospice nurse is there. She's often alone. We don't necessarily go in pairs. And a family member will step up and say, I really want to help, and it's good, come right in, I'm happy to have your help. Or we want to do this, and we just go out, go make coffee. It's what you want.
And I think an important piece that needs to be stated is the huge difference, well, a huge difference between hospice today and the hospice of families is that it's an arduous choice. It is often a decision that is made very difficult by having to decide about, do I do more treatment, or do I decide that I'm not going to do treatment and I'm going to let this take its course. I don't think that was a conversation 100 years ago when people were doing hospice in their homes as family caring for family, and that's complicated things immensely, is having to navigate the way we do medicine and try to figure out where hospice comes into that. And so I feel like sometimes one of the things that we do, because of generations being separated from death and comfort with death, is we model how to be comfortable. And I know you're aware of this, Mary. And so it can be helping a family who's incredibly angry because a diagnosis wasn't soon enough. They feel something was missed. They feel cheated. They're angry is the primary emotion in the moment. Maybe the nurse or the social worker walks in, and we help try to shift that emotion to focus on the patient. And we do that by modeling, by talking to the patient, and by really being comforting to family and friends, hugging, touching, and kind of bringing people back into that human fold, into that humanness, and helping them focus and talking, taking the silence out of the room, and maybe bringing music, asking questions that will elicit stories, trying to maybe bring some laughter. What was funny? Who is this person? And I think that's a lot of what we can offer. And sometimes I feel like I can just do that one time and I can just leave everybody alone. I can just back off. They just needed somebody to show them how to go. So I think sometimes that's all we do. And then help people be comfortable and out of pain, which is incredibly important.
I think another really important thing that hospice provides too is, when you're confronted with that individual that you care so much about and you know they're going to go, unless you're odd like me and you've decided to really look into it, a lot of people just don't know what to do, and the hospice worker is a wonderful source of information for when you get to that, well, what do I do now part, and that's throughout the whole dying process. Like, what do I do now? And it is so helpful to have someone you can turn to who's probably going to be able to give you the answer or some options. So I think that's also really important.
This is making me think back again, back to the midnight oil and the long vigil. And one of the things that was so exhausting was that you didn't have as many tools as we have now for addressing suffering. So you were sitting with people's suffering. And we like to avoid that. we really have a hard time sitting with other people's suffering. And then we had no choice because there was no relief of suffering. Now we have relief of suffering that is provided professionally, that the medicines primarily that have to be administered by a professional. And we can bring that home now. You don't have to go to the hospital to have pain relief. We can bring pain relief home. And we can teach you how to use pain relief. And it's in your home because we're there. And you you don't need to go elsewhere to get it, and that I won't say that suffering is then erased. It's not erased because there's emotional suffering that's appropriate to go through, to be in. But the agony of the dying can be relieved, and therefore also the witnesses and the helpers are relieved.
And that also, I think, helps to alleviate the feeling of helplessness. Because once you get that diagnosis, like, what can you do to help that person? And so then you can give some guidance on what you actually can do so you don't feel quite as helpless in the whole situation.
When people come to hospice, they often feel really everything's gone out of control. Their choices, they don't choose to be sick, and they certainly aren't wanting to be calling hospice. And our real goal in that first meeting is to stress to them that they may not want to be in hospice, but they are in charge. And they will get called back. They don't have to wait 3 weeks for a callback. Because this is what people have been enduring when they're fighting cancer. They're waiting on lab tests. They're waiting on a callback. They're waiting to see if the cancer center in Seattle thinks they're a candidate. And these calls don't come. They just wait and wait. So we really work hard to be there when we say we'll be there, to be there when they want us to be there, and to call back and to acknowledge that they're in charge and that we don't know what to do until they tell us what to do. And I think that is a really good thing that hospice does, is giving people that feeling of control.
You know, one of the other things that I really like about hospice, I work in assisted living and I oversee the cares of the resident. And I would say that the best part for me with knowing that I can call hospice in is that there are advocates for that death and how that looks. And they make sure that those wishes are honored, and then they can give everybody else the tools that they need, as far as my team, that are the caregivers, to kind of make those wishes come true. And so there's just that point person, and they're the advocate, and that's the way I see it. And I see, like, okay, find out, you know, I always direct them, like, hospice is the one, because it's the point person that's really going to make sure that all these wishes are taken care of. And the hospice team is constantly just flowing in and out, whether it be the nurses or the social worker, or the harvest or the chaplain. I mean, just there's this whole team that then comes in and makes that happen, and then is making sure that everybody else that's given that care, which would be my team, we're honoring that. And I really respect that, because I think that's important. I think that death does not have to be a bad thing. I think that we should celebrate the lives. And I think that we should do that by honoring them when they go and how they want to go. And that's, I think, the most powerful thing about hospice, is that they advocate for how that person wants to leave the world, and that is huge.
Well, one of the lovely things that is a tradition for community conversations, and being as this is our annual, I think this is our annual.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary, 1 year. Is that we just go around the room and share, you know, our name if you're comfortable, and then something that you'll take from the conversation tonight that you will share with someone else, or that has shifted your own perspective in some way. So you're in the hot seat. You get to start.
Again, what
Will
did
the
they
camera,
say
you
last
always
time?
pick the same seat. Or is the camera going to be off or on?
The camera is on. Although this is filmed by MCAT, so if you feel like you do not want to be filmed, you can certainly let him know and he can post it.
You can wear a mask.
We have 1 million views per week, so it's hot stuff.
I'm John, and I think many of you know our son died a little over 4 months ago. And I thought maybe we could get through this without getting emotional. You
Good
know?
luck.
Yeah. And I'd had some help, but she was the primary caregiver the last 9 weeks, and I think she can tell you about it. I think the last 2 weeks we got hospice in, and It just made all the difference for them. What we can do to support hospice, we're willing to do. We appreciate your efforts.
Yeah, I was with our son in Colorado, and they also have a wonderful hospice organization and a wonderful hospice care center where his original choice was to be at home, and it turned out that we couldn't do everything for him at home. Hospice couldn't provide what he needed, and he had a lot of pain, and so they have a wonderful hospice care center, and I sometimes try to think of what I knew before that experience versus what I know now, and I can't remember how little I knew because, you know, of the intensity and the depth of that experience. But a lot of what you've talked about, how normal death seems, and I've experienced a lot of deaths in my life. My mother died when I was a child. My sister died when I was in my 30s. My dad died when I was in my 30s, on and on and on. But as you all know, when you lose a child, it's the whole different level, and it does seem really normal now. We have part of our son's ashes in our living room, and I take a lot of comfort in that. Part of them are in Colorado, where they'll be distributed there in his favorite backpacking place, and here in his favorite backpacking place. He wanted to be in both places. And I just really wish that everybody could reach a point where they could have that sort of normalcy, I guess, because I know how it was when my mom died, you know, and so I really appreciate these conversations because it's kind of a way to step out of the daily process of this and kind of just sit down and focus on it, and then go back to what life is now. So thank you all for what you do.
My name is Kathy. One of the things that came to me when we were talking about death historically is that in my family the story is that my grandfather died of a sliver in his finger. And this was back in the 20s, and that certainly wouldn't happen today. But he must have had blood poisoning, and it just took over his body. And the story is that my father had smallpox, and the house was quarantined, but because my grandfather died and they had to open it up to the parlor, they took the sign off the house. So we're talking practicality as we talked, and that's what we have had to do, and we don't often face that, and we need to realize that there are practical decisions to be made about what we, and it should be part of who we are and what we do.
Well, I'm Mary. I think my takeaway tonight is the realization that I usually think I have a lot of these things figured out, but I really don't know. I actually don't even think I know what my most recent advance directive says about my wishes as far as cremation and burial go. I know I changed it at some point, but I had lunch today with my sister and my parents, and
just conversations. They're so easy, and it's not difficult. We got in a conversation because of your article and wondering if they'd come tonight. And I said, "So, Dad, are you gonna get the bookshelf coffin?"
I love those.
He's a practical guy, you know. Will you use it as a bookshelf until you need it? And it's just so easy to talk about. But I'm taking away that I think the people that I want to know what I want if I were ill and not able to speak for myself or needed an attempt at resuscitation, that's all in order. But I don't really know about the craisins part. I have feelings about it, about which way I'd sway, but I don't think the right people know, and that I really know exactly.
Well, I'm even less involved than Mary is in my thinking, so it's been very important for me to be here tonight, both because we're sitting there with our parents today, and I know I'm on their advance directive, and they've never had a discussion with me about it. So, just the idea that these conversations could happen and could be easier and whatever, because they've kind of avoided it, thinking certainly they're never going to die, they're only 91.
Well, they figure one or the other of them will be there for themselves, and that you're just a backup.
Right. So,
We have it covered.
to say nothing of the fact that I'm not as advanced as Mary is in thinking about my own situation, so I've appreciated it. I enjoyed or was interested in hearing about the options we have in Montana about things, because that opens up a lot of things to me to think about. So I appreciate your work and the whole concept of hospice.
My name is Tanya, and I think my favorite takeaway of the night, and Nan and Nancy, I think you guys both kind of touched on it a little bit, which is, this is my own interpretation of what you guys said, was we should kind of think about it and not fear it. And we should talk about it and see that it is a part of something that is going to happen. And it's not a bad thing. It just is. And I think that me being so young, and I work in this field and death and dying all the time, it's changed my life, because it makes me want to be a better person every day, because I want the end to be as smooth as possible. And I do believe everything boomerangs back around. And so I want mine to be a peaceful passing, and I think that has to do with the way I'm living my life now. And so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
My name is Ricky, and I guess I've been blessed throughout my life because I've had such a wonderful extended family, grandparents that have lived into their 90s, strong faith tradition. So to me, it hasn't been a strange, taboo topic. And so sometimes I forget how strange and taboo it is to so many people in our society. And I've worked as a social worker for many years.
We're talking, about our discomfort with death, and I had a lady in my office who was telling me that she was trying to get her kids and grandkids to pick out what they wanted when she died, and they wouldn't. They just kept crying and running out of the room. And I thought, all that she wants is to know that somebody's going to appreciate and love her things as much as she did. And it was odd to me too, like Ricky said, because we were very comfortable talking about death when I was growing up, and in my church are really comfortable with it too. I mean, I think we all know what everybody wants at their funeral when they die, and I thought it's sad that somebody who is thinking about the end of their life and wants a little comfort is being turned away by the people that they should be drawing comfort from. And I thought I've really been blessed in that way. And I thought I think about that lady. I think, how can I get a hold of her kids and tell them, you need to listen to your grandmother. Tell her that you want her china cups. She'll feel better.
I'm Nancy. Takeaway tonight, I'm going to just shift a little bit because I just love the history. It was so great. I'm going to try to connect with you and chat more. But I'm going to shift away because what I am taking away tonight, I actually learned before we got started, and that is that it's Mary Warner's birthday. And so we're going to him happy birthday to the wonderful harpist at St. Patrick's who brings so much relief and comfort to people every day. Okay, ready?
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Mary. Happy birthday to you.
It was really special today to have a quiet birthday and to play music for somebody who was dying, and I'm thinking, wow, it's my birthday, it's their death day. This is, what an honor.
And I just want to touch on that because I attended a death within the last week, and it was such an incredibly, some people aren't comfortable with the term, but it was a beautiful death. And two of the friends in the room accompanying the woman, it was their birthday. And they were thrilled. And that was so nice. They were just thrilled that she passed on their birthday. And they thought from now on they would have 2 reasons to celebrate on that day. That was cool.
Nancy, I have a tiny little share to go with that. Our son died on his girlfriend's birthday. And as we're sitting with him, as he's dying, one of the hospice nurses brought in a birthday cake, and she said, I understand it's Larkin's birthday. And we all looked at each other and trying to figure out who told him it was Larkin's birthday. Well, Zachariah told them. That's the only thing we could figure out because nobody said that they had done it. And so that is now Z-Day for...
And she hated her birthday, and now she says she's got something to remember and be significant.
He always insisted that she celebrate her birthday. She would always just let it go and say, oh, no. And he threw a party for her when he was in the hospital the year before, and we're convinced he planned it, so you don't remember your birthday. Anyway, thanks.
Well, I'm Marika, and I guess the thing that I am going to take away today is the amount of options that we have, because I never knew that until I worked in hospice, and I feel like there are so many people who don't know that. And certainly just meeting Susanne, when I think I'm like a hospice expert in some ways, like absolutely not. She totally blew my mind with all these resources and information that she had. And so, there's always more to learn, which is also fantastic. But that when I am thinking about my own death and talking to my family about my own death, to really feel limitless in that way, to explore things that might not be the only way that things have been done, and to look outside of funeral homes if that's my choice. I really appreciate you bringing that to the table. That's such a gift. I think we can all spread that word a little bit so that people understand that they have choices and options at the end of life. So thank you.
I'm Nan, and I was going to say something, and then you said that, so I have 2 things to say. And the first thing is I realized that I have now sat still for 2 hours.
Is that good or not?
It's highly unlikely. And I'm not asleep. And I'm upright. And I'm with people who want what I want, which is to know more about this and to understand it, to do it well. I want to do this well. I want us all to do this well, do it better. And every one of you does too, so I feel joined. I feel met and not lonely. And what your story gives me is more, I'm collecting these stories, the stories and experiences that seem to suggest or reinforce what I am firmly certain of, which is this is not all there is, and what we are is immaterial, not material, and continues to exist. And And we have ways of knowing and communicating that don't require our bodies to either give out or receive. And when I'm with, it's so, how should I say, authority, meaning not authority, but the grounded certainty of, I know this, is really important just to me personally. So that when I speak to this teenager whose mom is dying, when I tell her that she's losing her mom's body, she's losing her mom's physical presence, and her mom is still here. Her mom is here right now, and mom is going to continue to be here, and helping, just talking about that in a very important way to her in that moment, but also as matter of fact and casual as I can make it, because I think that that's what gets through. Oh yeah, she's here. Yes. In fact, please talk to her. Talk to her right now, and continue to talk to her for the rest of your life. And so that's a good story, and that's a true story that is in my collections, and it helps me have that simple authority that I know this, which only I can know what I know, but thank you for adding to my certainty.
I read a little paragraph in one of my group readings the last couple of weeks that called that the Transformation Day, and that was the word I've been looking for a long time. Was that there was a transformation that took place, and I love words too, and that one really.
We're moving from one state to another. There's two states, two ways of being.
Well, a couple things occurred to me. One was when you mentioned a good death. And there's this long history of this belief of a good death. And that typically is on your own terms to a certain extent, where your wishes are met and when you can go where you wish to be, so as at the home. And another thing that actually occurred to me earlier before we started this talk is we want so much to make people feel better. And sometimes it's in avoiding things. So like it's avoiding talking to grandma about what you would like. When my mom asked me what I would like from my grandmother's, she's still alive, 90 years old. I stopped because for a moment I didn't want to think about that. I didn't want to think, like, I don't want to be a vulture picking at, what grandma has, but no, it's good to know that, those are those mementos that you want, and that, these emotions, they're strong and they're good and they're part of this. And some historians have thought that because people used to be more accustomed to death, it didn't hurt them as much. And that's not true. I think, when you lost a child 100 years ago, it hurt just as much as when you lost a child today. We just had slightly different ways of accepting that. So, and that's another thing that hospice is so good with too, is it's answering those questions, and it's helping people to deal with this whole process on their own terms as much as possible.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Leanna, for facilitating. This is just such a wonderful topic to really discuss. You're all welcome to stay for a while. There are certainly snacks and drinks if you wanted to pick Suzanne's mind and anyone else here. I have a talk about it button that I would love to give to somebody, and then if you end up discussing that with someone else, I'd like you to pass it along. So that's sort of a token, and I think we have a couple more here that we could share. So, I think that we are all sort of on the same page where we want to consider this a conversation that we have every day. It's a normal part of life. And In fact, I saw this great cartoon that this woman was going out, you know, with the Grim Reaper to a taxi, and she was like, "Death in taxis? Where the hell is that?" I love that cartoon because, you know, but there has to be humor about it too. That's what makes it, you know, normal, and that's part of our lives. So laughing about it also is great. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.